Hey, hello everyone. I'm just going to figure out how to see all of my my panelists because I'm a technophobe. Here we go. There's Miranda. Rob.
I like your very festive background, Rob. It's lovely.
Yes, Rob has pre-warned us that there might be a cat that intrudes into this panel, but I mean, I think we all agreed that that would be an exceptionally Jackson-esque thing, and that we would, if anything, encourage that. I think
yeah, I mean, I hope so.
Jonah say that would kind of be the kind of cream on the cake, but no, she should be fine. She's a bit kind of sedate now, so.
And Daniel, are you there, Daniel?
Yo, I'm here.
Oh, grand job. Great. I think I'll get started then, since it's thank you so much. Yeah, a lovely Christmas wreath behind you as well, Daniel. So you're all getting in the festive spirit. So welcome to our third and final panel here tonight, the future of Shirley Jackson studies. I've just taught the sundial, so I'm going to make lots of sundial references in my intro. We're going to get our mirror, cover it in olive oil, gaze into it, find a suitable adolescent girl to look into it, and then she will tell us what the future of Shirley Jackson studies is. If there's one in the chat, she can feel free to chip in. Please do, you're very, very welcome. A Gloria figure. So I have here an assemblage of up and coming and emerging and already emerged Jackson scholars, and I'm truly delighted to talk to you about this topic here today. First of all, we have Miranda Corcoran. Hello, Miranda. Welcome. Miranda is a lecturer in the Department of English at University College Cork. So she's coming from very far away, especially if you travel by Irish Rail. Don't get me started. And Miranda is the author of Witchcraft and Adolescence in American Popular Culture, and is also doing things on satanic feminism in popular culture, which are both topics that I can absolutely 100% get behind. So good job there, Miranda. We have then Daniel Kasper. Daniel is a lecturer at the University of Texas at Arlington, who studies Gothic fiction and film from Frankenstein to the present, with an emphasis on feminism and biopolitics. So thank you so much for joining us, Daniel. Then we have Rob Lloyd. Rob is currently a teacher of English literature. Hi, Rob, in the School of English, Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff University. He was awarded his PhD in January 2021, and a fine PhD it is. And his thesis explored metaphorical representations of ghostliness and spectral femininity across Jackson's writing. And very exciting news, he's currently working on a monograph proposal based on this research, which is great news, and is also in, just as great news, working on a selection of essays on Jackson's short fiction with Dr. Joan Passley from the University of Bristol. So shout out to Joan, if Joan's out there as well. Last but not least, we have here Janice Deitner, our own tech maven, co-organizer, and also Jackson scholar on the rise. Janice is, better pronounce your name correctly, Janice, is a third-year PhD candidate here in the School of English at TCD. She was the recipient of the 2019 Trinity College Dublin Provost PhD Award for the project Shirley Jackson Beyond Hill House, and her PhD focuses on the intersection and interaction of bodies and minds in Shirley Jackson's America. Janice, I've also heard that your supervisor is a real piece of work, but we'll keep that to the blog, okay? It's too much to go into on the panel. Okay, then. So without further ado, as we battle it out, America's Next Top Model style, to see who will be the future of Shirley Jackson studies, who will get the golden crown, or whose corpse will be propped up against a sundial whilst the storm encroaches. As I said, I just thought the sundial. No, we're not going to change the format at short notice. You will all survive. What I'd like to do, just to get things started, is you're all currently working on Jackson, or have very, very recently worked on Jackson. And I'm really interested if we could just maybe very briefly kind of go around the virtual room, maybe starting with you, Miranda, very briefly sort of outline your own research relationship with Jackson. What are you working on? What have you worked on? And how did that kind of come to be?
Yeah, so Jackson does seem to be a sort of, at the moment, well, for the last couple of years, a sort of recurring presence in my own research. So my most recent big chunk of work is probably my monograph, which is coming out next year. And it's all about teen witches in American popular culture. And Jackson features quite heavily there because obviously Shirley Jackson is someone who has written extensively about witches or witch-like figures. And she's also someone who's really interested in the history of witchcraft. But she's also someone who has written a lot about adolescents and teenage girls. She's someone who, in both her horror fiction and her domestic writing has written about the experiences of dealing with teenage girls, or the slightly strange experience of dealing with teenage girls because of their maybe inherent uncanniness. So Shirley Jackson features quite heavily in my monograph. I have a chapter that deals a lot with Mary Cat in We Have Always Lived in the Castle, who I think is sort of a consummate teen witch. Particularly, I find her particularly fascinating to discuss in terms of witchcraft, actually, because she exists sort of outside of any kind of really structured witchcraft tradition. Joyce Carol Oates describes Mary Cat's witchcraft as self-invented. So I love that. So I write about Mary Cat in my monograph because she might just be my favorite literary character of all time. And then I've recently completed an essay for Rob's collection about Shirley Jackson's relationship to Joseph Glanville's 17th century witchcraft text, Sadducismus Triumphatus, and how that influences her short stories, and particularly the very interesting merging of the mundane and the supernatural that you get in Jackson's work. And I'm thinking now of kind of looking at some of Jackson's work in terms of like eco-criticism as well. So that's something I've just started looking at. So yeah, lots of Shirley Jackson.
Yeah, great. And it's interesting you mentioned Mary Cat there. She's come up a few times already, but in my own teaching experiences, I find that she doesn't just resonate with people of a certain age, but I find, because teaching a lot of people who are in their late teens or early 20s, that's a character that really runs and runs. I mean, she has an impact in a really interesting way, and I could talk about it all night, but it's interesting that you're mentioning that as well. Thank you so much, Miranda. Rob, what about yourself?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Great to be here. I first encountered Jackson on my master's, actually. So there was a module on Gothic and gender on which The Haunting of Hill House was there. And I'd heard of Jackson before, had kind of wasn't able really to place her definitively, had heard of The Lottery kind of roundabout. And I read this novel and I have never had such a strong reaction to a novel. I just thought, this is just incredible. I thought, and so it just kind of rocked my world completely. And so originally I had been kind of working on more kind of, so my original kind of research was focused more on kind of 20th century American dystopia. So I was kind of thinking in that mode. And the more I just couldn't get this novel out of my head. And I thought the more I thought about it, the more, no, do you know what, I'm not interested in that. I want to do something on Jackson. And was thinking about how to go about it, because, the more that you kind of get into Jackson, you realize just kind of the dominance of the big three. So, The Lottery, Hill House, Castle, and thinking, well, those are, they're fantastic novels and wouldn't kind of, at all kind of want to move to kind of, discredit them by any means. But I was wondering, is there a way to kind of move beyond this? So I started out by thinking, well, I'll do something on Hill House as a kind of a transitional kind of into Jackson studies. And then, in discussion with my supervisor, thought, do you know what, if the whole point of this thesis is to kind of move beyond Hill House, let's kind of do just that. Let's kind of put Hill House kind of to one side and kind of, and then kind of embrace a more kind of diverse range of her work. Yeah, so my PhD focused on two of her novels. So I looked at Hangs a Man and The Bird's Nest, where kind of they each had a chapter. And then I had a chapter on her selection of her short stories. So things like The Missing Girl and Nightmare and The Good Wife, and the two versions of The Honeymoon of Mrs. Smith are in there. And then the final chapter was looking at her life writing. So looking at her two memoirs, Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons, and then also a selection of her kind of personal sketches and autobiographical essays that are collected in Let Me Tell You. And I thought, that I think was the most interesting chapter to write on, because it was a side of Jackson which I had never really thought about. You tend to think, but I think principally still we think of Jackson as a foremost writer of Gothic horror and kind of, in that mode. But her domestic stuff is equally it's earth-shatteringly awesome. Just the sheer range of stuff that she writes in there, and also the kind of the symbiosis between the kind of domestic and Gothic sides of her, as already been mentioned tonight, I think is so intensely interesting. So that was kind of that work. And then, as you say, at the moment, I'm working on kind of turning that into a monograph. So kind of thinking what I want to do, and this is kind of thanks to you, Bernice, is to kind of particularly in the work on Jackson's life writing, is to start incorporating the work on the letters. I mean, the letters, I think, have opened up this whole new frontier in terms of how we understand Jackson and the kind of her skills as a writer. So I'm looking very much to kind of incorporate that into my research. And then, yeah, in terms of the short fiction, the collection I'm doing with Joan, we're very keen to kind of broaden out this conception of Jackson beyond the lottery, because I think of all her texts, the lottery has this, I mean, we know how, The Haunting of Hill House kind of predominates her novels, but we also have Castle. I think in her short fiction, very few people who are aware of Jackson know many more stories than the lottery. And so what we're kind of explicitly trying to do in that collection is to say, look, the range, if you kind of understand Jackson's short fiction through the lottery, you are missing so much of the nuance and complexity and just range of her writing. So we're very much trying to position her work beyond that. So yeah, kind of honoring the critical heritage, but also opening it out into new and hopefully interesting perspectives as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Robin. I think you're sort of, we've touched upon this already, but there has been for such a long time, there was such a critical trend towards one or two texts in particular, obviously Hill House, the lottery. And I think something that all of you are doing is really, and also many of the other panelists who've been here today as well, is really showing how much work there is, really exciting work left to do, and the totality of Jackson's and the versatility of her output. So thank you so much. So Janice, I mean, you're someone who's obviously currently working on a PhD on Jackson. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, the parameters of my Provost Award, which I believe you mentioned it, which Bernice set up, it is sort of to look beyond Hill House. It's actually called Beyond Hill House. So it seems to be a trend here to sort of get beyond what the texts and the themes that are always looked at. And so I have a sort of a drive to look at the neglected texts that Rob mentioned, the themes that don't come up. And what that's led me to is looking at sort of the intersection of bodies and minds in Jackson's work. Bodies, meaning communal bodies, how communities are formed, especially around knowledge, who knows what, and what community does that put them in, but also physical bodies. The way she discusses or doesn't discuss physical bodies in her work, and so how that those two very broad ways of looking at things coalesce into a way of looking at her from a historicist perspective, from her early years and the post-war years, and what does it mean that she was an intellectual in the post-war years at a time when intellectuals were being sort of removed from the communal body of the United States. They were being pointed at as, part of the communist threat. And so all of these things are sort of overlapping into a few different ways of looking at the physical and the mental, and the communal and the individual. And I do have a piece in Rob's collection and looking at science fiction, actually, and currently I'm working on a different element of Jackson in science fiction, which is how she was able to publish in science fiction magazines, but she was not part of the club. And so it's the same sort of thing of her being sort of invited into these intellectual communities, but being pushed out. And the same thing at the New Yorker. So that's one thing I'm very interested in, is how she fits into these societies or doesn't, how she constructs societies in her fiction, and then who gets to be part of those societies. Yes, I also have a piece I'm working on, hopefully for Miranda's collection, on satanic figures and knowledge in Jackson. And I still have to figure that one out, but yeah, that's the overview.
And I think too, Janice, you've hit upon the idea that, the idea that Jackson for a long time wasn't really situated in the 50s, and then she was, and then in a way that became kind of quite a dominant way of looking at her. But even within that, there's still a huge amount of landscape that really hasn't been fully traversed yet. And it's such a complex post-war publishing milieu that there's so much out there to be further explored. So thank you so much, Janice. And then Daniel, what about yourself?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Like a lot of people, I read Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived at the Castle, and it literally changed who I was as a person on the inside. I went on to study the Gothic more generally from there. And Jackson has always been sort of the peripheral figure in my particular research, just because of the Gothic stuff. So I'm interested in her mainly as a term for haunted house things. And I have to thank Jill Anderson, who put together the Shirley Jackson Society ALA panel that year that I was. She had to step down because she couldn't come, and I chaired. And then I was invited by Lauren Hartle at Women's Studies to help put together an issue on Shirley Jackson specifically. Rob's in there, Emily Banks is in there, Pat is in there. So that particular, there was sort of a rule that wasn't really a rule, that we weren't going to talk about the lottery and we weren't going to talk about haunting a Hill House. And so, of course, my introduction to that talks about the lottery and nothing else, because Harold Bloom is a unprintable word, and so I felt the need to sort of push us, say the thing out loud so that we can move past it. And then I also have my chapter in Christopher Woofter's Shirley Jackson, A Companion, is about two of the unpublished stories that were that came out in Let Me Tell You, I'm pretty sure. No, come along with me. No, one of them. Sorry, one of the the one from the 90s that her kids put together. And it's about the story, The Mystery of the Murdered Bride, or The Honeymoon of Mrs. Smith, which is actually two versions of the same story that were never published in her lifetime. And my article or chapter is about, yes, just an ordinary day. Thank you. My article is about the sort of impossibility of resurrecting Shirley Jackson as an author because of the nature of authorship, and there's Roland Barthes stuff in there, and so like much we want to bring a totalizing understanding of what Jackson is to the forefront of American literature, which I seriously, sincerely do. It's always going to be a sort of fragmentary, impossible construction. And then I was just recently at LA again with Emily Banks. So I'm like one of the 4 people on the Shirley Jackson Society. So it's in progress. I'm wanting to think about her in terms of, or with alongside Patricia Highsmith and maybe Baldwin, for their particular sort of queerness and also exile stuff that starts to happen in that sort of milieu of the post 45 but pre 1969 era, and that's real speculative, real early stuff.
And again, I think what you're on through there, and what everyone's kind of said here, is that there has been this, I don't want to use the word explosion, but there's been a wave. There's been a lot done in the last few years, but there's still so much scope for work to be done, and so many exciting other arenas and relationships and connections that Jackson had with other writers, and it's all. I just find it all tremendously exciting, and it's great to get a sense of the kind of the work that's happening at the cutting edge of Jackson studies. I didn't mean that sarcastically, though it sounded accidentally sarcastic because of my voice. So one of the things that happens is that with the recent growth of scholarly and popular interest in Jackson, I mean, this is something that we had a really interesting conversation actually with Melanie Anderson, Lisa Kroger, and it was Lisa who mentioned this, and then Melanie picked it up as well, was the idea that Jackson has become a public figure in a really interesting way once more, and to a much greater extent than she even was in the 50s. But there have been, there's been several, high profile sort of essay collections, which again, we've talked about both in our asynchronous and our live panels as well. Journal editions, such as the one that Daniel was involved with, the really excellent Franklin biography from 2016, the release of the letters last year, or it feels like, sorry, it's pandemic time. It was only about 5 months ago. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you guys is, because there is this raft of new material, posthumous publications, and sort of scholarly interventions coming to light. So I wondered if how you think these developments might sort of continue to kind of shape the way in which Jackson studies evolves over the next 3 years, as much as we can ever try and figure out or sort of anticipate what might happen within sort of a scholarly field. Yeah, Rob. Yeah.
Oh, so okay, yeah, no. I mean, what I was kind of, we kind of touched on it already. I think what I'm hoping it will do is we'll just kind of see, as you say, a wave of work that is kind of looking beyond the kind of text by which we know Jackson already. I mean, that's one of the interesting things I think about the Jackson Renaissance, is that in its broadest terms, I think part of the issue I had with it initially was that it was making the most visible parts of Jackson's work kind of more visible. You know, there was this kind of heightened visibility around questions of, oh, she's, Hill House, we know her through the lottery and Castle. And there was a sense in which, for me, it was this kind of partial resurrection of her as a kind of figure. And I think what's happening more often now is perhaps not so much in more popular forms, but specifically in academic forms, is you are getting an awareness of Jackson beyond those texts and reading and situating her within different kind of contexts as well. So, we've kind of spoken a little bit about how a text like the Lottery, see, that's probably it's so kind of predominant in your consciousness, how a text like the Sundial might be kind of read in all sorts of kind of interesting kind of queer apocalyptic ways, sort of narratives of kind of Cold War history, all this stuff which is kind of there. But because we kind of position Jackson within this Gothic mode, I think we miss an awful lot of stuff. And I think part of maybe the reason for that is that, the terms in which we discuss Jackson are kind of, they kind of invite this Gothic reading. We kind of talk about her as a kind of domestic writer, and, domestic kind of positioning for women in mid-20th century America is kind of an inherently Gothic modality, right? And I think that is kind of one of the ways in which, that has done some really fascinating work. But I think perhaps the more that we maybe push back against her characterization as an exclusively Gothic or horror writer, and think about the different range of contexts in which she's situated, we're going to see a range of work which kind of complexifies her, that kind of says, she's, and by that I don't at all mean to be kind of dismissive of Gothic, because Gothic is, it's kind of what I live and breathe. It is kind of an inherently complex modality of its own right. But I think in some senses it is slightly critically limiting. And I think that, particularly kind of Chris Woofter's work and kind of the work that's been done in Shirley Jackson and Companion is really starting to generate these new ways of kind of situating her and contextualizing her. And I really hope that trend continues.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yeah, and I think you're spot on about the Gothic side of things. I think it's in a way kind of a holdover from the fact that for so long within literary kind of the literary milieu, the prominence that she had was particularly she was particularly beloved within the horror and Gothic community, and a lot of the research subsequently kind of, or a lot of people came to her perhaps through that and through Hill House and the Lottery in particular, which was understandable and welcome in a lot of ways, but also meant that there was for a long time, quite a narrow, perhaps way in which she was tended to be viewed as well. Miranda, did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to echo Rob's point about moving beyond that characterization of Jackson as primarily a Gothic writer. And I know we've all had those sort of conversations where we joke about the marketing of some of Jackson's books, where even her more, I don't want to say realist works, but even her works that are far less Gothic in tone, even her works that are, perhaps more humorous, are marketed or framed through that sort of Gothic lens, or framed as a sort of sensational, sort of like mid-century women's Gothic writing. So I think that one thing that is important and that's emerging at the moment in terms of the current resurgence of Jackson scholarship is this desire to explore Jackson beyond that sort of narrow category of a Gothic writer or of a horror writer. But I think as part of that as well, I think people are becoming more comfortable with the sort of uncategorizable nature of Jackson, the fact that she's very, very difficult to fit within a specific genre or to fit within a type of writing. And I think that recent criticism sort of revels in that ambiguity and explores that ambiguity and is more comfortable with that, where previously, so much criticism was centered around deciding, is Jackson a horror writer, or is Jackson a writer of domestic fiction? Is she a writer of the Gothic, or is she, a writer of these humorous slice of life pieces? But I think the kind of current wave of Jackson scholarship is far more comfortable with recognizing that, in fact, she's both, and she's, that she occupies a whole host of different sort of generic positions at once and simultaneously, and crosses them over in such a fascinating set of ways. Even these ideas that, Janice and other people have touched on about how parts of Jackson's work, things like the Sundial, could be located within the science fiction genre or the speculative fiction genre, and that they have elements of that, but that they also have elements of satire and Black comedy and, family narratives. So I think, one of the things that I'm very excited about in the recent crop of Jackson scholarship is the kind of increasing comfort with her refusal, I think, as a writer to adhere to any kind of generic category. And I think that's really exciting. And I think that's producing a lot of very innovative work at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think too, you know, it's fascinating, as you sort of have pointed out, that characteristics of Jackson's oeuvre that were previously, let's face it, often used against her, are now seen as strengths. Her versatility, her hybridity, her evasion of conventional critical categories. They're all part of the reason, I think, why there's so much interest in her, which, as you've kind of pointed out very well. I mean, Janice, did you have anything you wanted to chip in there?
I actually was thinking about how I started this PhD as a sort of Gothic and horror scholar, and that's not really the focus that I'm taking at all. And just sort of building off of what Rob said there, and sort of thinking about moving away from the ways that we tend to frame her. And you mentioned the letters up front, like how is this going to sort of shape scholarship in the future? I have a concern that with, for example, the movie Shirley, that there is a history of Shirley herself being sort of read in certain ways, and I'm concerned that if she becomes this pop culture figure that we talked about in the conversation with Anderson and Kroger, that we lose her, and that she becomes sort of read. Or she becomes an empty cipher for whatever, whatever projections people want to put on her. I think the letters are really important because they let her speak. You hear her voice, and it's not her narrators, and it's not her fiction, which we should be reading as well. But I think that's a really useful opportunity to keep her centered, and to not lose sight of who we're talking about and why. Because I think that is a danger.
Yeah, and even though, I mean, the novel it's based on is called Shirley, a Novel by Susan Scarf Merrill, so the fictionality is underlined in the title. And even though, to their credit, the makers of the film were very, this is not a biography. I've repeatedly seen it described, and by people who've seen it, oh, I saw the Shirley Jackson biography, and it's not a biography. It's really important. So we could do a whole panel on the film, because I think there's some really interesting things about it, but some sort of potentially problematic things about it as well, in terms of its depiction of Jackson, or a certain version of Jackson. Thank you so much, Janice. And Daniel, what about you?
Well, I've been nodding along just really happily with what everybody else is saying. I do want to sort of echo Rob. I think he was talking about like the potential for opening up the new avenues of inquiry includes sort of setting aside some of these things that we know about haunting and lottery and castle. But my hope with that is that we set those things aside for a bit of time, and then go through these avenues into these other spaces. And then we can sort of reintegrate these incredibly major, not just Shirley Jackson, but American novels back into what we think of as the canonical sort of thing that we're teaching. So one of the things they were talking about at the first panel is how like we sort of disavow Gothic fiction in American literature by women especially, but how we're constantly disavowing it. And that leaves us with Harold Bloom's version of the Western canon, which is really, really boring. And so I'm hoping that this wave allows us to sort of repair as well as we can her like exclusion from these spaces and literary communities where she absolutely belonged, even while she was belonging to the popular culture as a popular figure. Like she herself called herself a witch for popularity purposes. Like some of her agency is in becoming this cipher that people can put their own stuff on.
Yeah, I mean, there was a creation of a persona, a very deliberate, and arguably to an extent that slightly backfired. And she realized there's the letter where she goes, "Oh my God, I kept going on about being a witch, and I kept making up all this stuff out of old mystery stories, and they printed it as if I actually meant it." So I mean, I think that side of things, that her own sense of her standing and her public profile from quite early on is really, really interesting. Thanks so much, Daniel. And one thing, I mean, this is something that I was sort of interested in hearing about, and I'll start with Miranda, because Miranda, you mentioned eco-Gothic, which is something I've dabbled very slightly in myself, but there's people that there did incredible stuff in eco-Gothic, and it's a really exciting area within Gothic studies. So I was going to ask people generally if there's any critical approaches to Jackson which they feel have been perhaps underrepresented to date. And I mean, I'm not aware myself of any previous work on eco-Gothic and Jackson. Maybe there has been stuff out there I'm just not aware of, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, Miranda, or is it something that's still in the early stages?
I mean, it's in the very early stages. So far, I've written a conference abstract, but it's something I can think, yeah, I know.
That starts with a single step.
It does. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, because one thing I do talk about in my book is sort of like the representation of nature and the idea of nature as being sort of, agentic and active rather than passive. And I started thinking about that in terms of We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which again, kind of going back to my deep adoration for that book. And like, I guess one of the things people always talk about when they're thinking about We've Always Lived in the Castle and its brilliance is that incredible opening paragraph where Mary Cat introduces herself to the audience. And she talks about, her likes and her dislikes and her family. And one of the things she talks about liking is the death cup mushroom. And I started thinking about how witches and their relationship with nature, because I do read Mary Cat as very much being a witch or a witch-like figure. Witches and their relationship with nature is often very much sentimentalized, particularly if you think back to like second wave feminism that imagines, women persecuted for witchcraft or women executed for witchcraft as being, these sort of earth mother figures. And it's very sentimentalized and it's very idealized and very romanticized. And I really like that in We've Always Lived in the Castle, Jackson doesn't do that. And she instead identifies Mary Cat with the darker elements of nature, with poisonous mushrooms and rot and decay and fungus, and that Mary Cat very much revels in these. So I'm sort of reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle, along with another novel from the 1970s called Elizabeth, a novel of the unnatural, which also features a teenage witch. Yes, yeah. One of the paperbacks from Hell books, but I'm reading the two together because they both feature these teenage witch protagonists whose relationship with nature isn't sentimentalized and it isn't romanticized, and nature isn't figured as this sort of passive playground for self-discovery, but instead it's this very dark, active, alluring force. So that's what I'm looking at at the moment. But I do think there's kind of a lot more room to look at Jackson's relationship with the natural world in her work and how it's represented. Even just thinking about things like the recently published, well, not very recently, I think it was about 2014 story, The Man in the Woods, for example, and how that represents nature. And of course, it has the very characteristic Jackson figure of the, almost magical, familiar cat. So like throughout her work, she does have a very interesting view of nature as not necessarily being this passive playground for humanity, but rather a kind of complex entity in and of itself. Or even thinking, again, you were referencing the sundial, the fact that one of the things the characters discuss in that is the ways in which nature might renew itself after some kind of cataclysmic event, and what that might be like, and how it might be different to have this sort of wild, resurgent nature in comparison to perhaps the more kind of tamed or attempted to tame nature that you get within the estate. So I think she deals with nature in some very complex and interesting ways. And I think she's one of those writers who doesn't romanticize nature and doesn't idealize it as this kind of passive space. So I'm kind of interested in seeing how that will work in my own work, but I'm also interested in seeing perhaps how other people might draw out some of those themes, particularly with, the eco-Gothic becoming so prevalent at the moment as well.
Absolutely. And I could really see their scope for, I'm thinking of I think Rob, you did Hangsaman. So there's, obviously a lot in your PhDs, there's a lot of stuff there about nature and gardens and bad things happening in sort of wild spaces.
Yeah. The way that the kind of the trees, and what really interesting about that novel is the way that the trees are kind of this medium for Natalie's trauma, that they're kind of, she has such this strong kind of association that kind of the wooded area in which her sexual assault kind of takes place, and then that kind of is reactivated, and the way that it kind of, that Tony's appearance is kind of tied to this kind of arboreal subjectivity. The Hangsaman is such an interesting novel to think about from that kind of eco-critical, eco-Gothic mode, absolutely. Actually, we've got one of the submissions to the short fiction collection is on The Man in the Woods, and kind of the tentative move towards eco-Gothic and eco-critical readings of Jackson. So yeah, so that's kind of what I was thinking. I was like, oh, you kind of
fascinating, because and that story is so ambiguous as well, and very much kind of in the vein. I know a lot of recent criticism is, you know, connecting Jackson to folk horror, and there's a real like folk horror element within The Man in the Woods as well. You know, this kind of idea of like potentially, you know, some kind of sinister pagan sacrifice, and yeah, so I think that will be really, really interesting to see. So I'm looking forward to reading that one.
Right.
So you've just reminded me, and this is a non-Shirley Jackson book recommendation, but Ken Greenhalgh did a book called Child's Grave, which is a brilliant folk horror novel that not many people have read, and it's in the paperbacks from hell, and it's really, really good. So
adding that to the list.
It's very cheerful, as the name would suggest, but it's really good. But I'm not going to mention any other writers unless they directly pertain to Shirley from now on. I've broken our sacred covenant, which is something that happens also in Ken Greenhalgh's novel. Daniel, did you have any sort of sense that there's any still underexplored avenues within the world of Jackson?
Shirley Jackson and race is a thing that we don't talk about enough. I know that Samantha Landau from Japan is writing on her relationship and back and forth with Ralph Ellison. So like she helped Ralph Ellison figure out how to write Invisible Man, like he gave him craft advice. I know that she was also like married to a Jewish intellectual in the middle of the whitest state in the Union. So she has a very serious concern with different kinds of whiteness as constructed by the places that are around. Emily Banks is talking about that when she's talking about the flower garden, like the different gradations of what whiteness actually means. And of course, just as a person from outside of the New England crazy Puritan stock, has a lot to say about how that area, the Vermont, the New England Gothic, sort of constructs a particular version of what race in America looks like. So in some senses, we could say, yeah, she's not talking about Black characters, except or very rarely talking about Black characters, but it's also like she's also writing about the whitest place on the planet in some really interesting ways. So I would like to see that kind of sort of conversation be brought up, even if it's in a sense that, oh, Jackson just collapses race and class in her writing, and that's the thing that we have to talk about and why that matters. But that's why I want to start thinking about her in terms of the Black writers who are contemporary with her in the same way that Sam is doing.
Absolutely, and we actually have one of our papers on our asynchronous content is talking about the flower garden, and Ralph Ellison gets a good mention. And I'm so sorry,
that's Sam.
That's her. Sorry,
her.
I apologize. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, no, that was Savannah.
Oh, Savannah, I'm so sorry, Savannah. So if anyone wants to check that out, Savannah's paper on the asynchronous content actually tackled some of these issues very well. Thanks so much, Daniel. I think you're absolutely correct. There's so much more work still to be done there. And a lot of what criticism has been done, which has been really excellent, and one can see why, has been done on the flower garden for obvious reasons, because it's perhaps the only Jackson story that kind of directly deals with race. But then there's the more nebulous side of things that I think that there's certainly scope to look at. Absolutely.
After you, my dear Alphonse. Yes. In the lottery. Yeah. Also something that I want to think about, the lottery short cycle in terms of race, because those two were included in that book for a reason. So.
Yeah, chronologically, it's interesting that they're both from the early stages in their career as well, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry, Rob, you were going to interject something there.
It was just to say on that, I mean, completely underlining what Daniel said there about race. I think if you are interested in Jackson and race, Alexis Shotwell has an essay called The Relational Formation of White Womanliness in Jackson's Work, which is kind of a really interesting take on that kind of question, problematic. She's phrasing it very much in this kind of need for not just kind of searching out Jackson's engagement with kind of notions of Blackness, but also the way that whiteness is kind of formed through kind of this kind of synchronicity between it and, kind of white middle class, kind of femininity and kind of the ways that those will work. So if you are interested in Jackson and race, anybody who's kind of watching this and is unfamiliar with that essay, I would absolutely recommend that as a place to start thinking about that kind of problematic.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll be able to put up that in the chat, hopefully, so we can do that and make sure that people are able to get the title as well. Janice, you've been hanging on a wee while there. Was there anything that you wanted to add in there?
I just want to defend my native New England.
As a New Englander.
I'm from the South. I get to say stuff like that.
No, I do think, and this has come up a few times tonight, that there are these different approaches that need to be taken. And I think, Bernice, you mentioned also that there is still so much to look at with the things that have been done. And I think with the post-war era, with the texts we've looked at over and over, but I just wanted to sort of stress, like, I really think there's a lot of exciting work going on with the posthumous collections, with the new ways of looking at things. I'm very excited about a lot of the sort of queer readings that are coming out. And I think there's just a lot of really good stuff out there. Yeah, I will just stress, if people want to join the Discord and share those resources, we'll have those there for you.
Thank you so much, Janice. I think we've got about 5 minutes before we go to the chat. I think we have a little bit of extra time, do we? Is that? I think we do. One of the things I want to talk about is that we have this, in addition to this wave of popular interest and new critical attention, there's also been this new wave of film and TV adaptations, and apparently quite a few projects in the pipeline. So Jackson, in terms of visual representations of her work, and also of Jackson herself, which is kind of touched upon already. So one thing, without necessarily maybe getting into a huge amount of detail about individual adaptations, perhaps, I'd be curious to see what place you see these, or sort of consideration of these Jackson adaptations or spin-off projects, one might call them, the Jackson cinematic universe, which is a term I keep trying to get going, but it doesn't really work. It's a very large cinematic universe. Black Swan's in it, definitely. But this more specific Jackson kind of products, I suppose, that are being visually adapted, or even her own sort of adaptations of Jackson as a character. What place do you see them as holding within Jackson studies? I mean, one thing that struck me is I was at a conference a few years ago, and there were multiple papers on the Netflix adaptation of Hill House, and there were not many papers on Shirley Jackson's work. And I'm not going to slag off. I thought there was interesting things about the show, but a little bit of me was like, oh, I thought that was an interesting trend. But I also felt, I hope that the adaptations don't necessarily, I think there's, I'm like the meme, why not both? So I wondered what your own take on how we sort of negotiate these new, particularly visual representations of Jackson in Jackson studies. I suppose that's a very long-winded way of putting that. So Daniel, were you slowly waving or doing a Karate Kid?
Yes. So I also noticed that trend, and it made a lot of sense to me because, of course, they didn't know the actual Shirley Jackson. Like, all of my friends asked me, hey, have you seen this thing? And I watched the first episode, and an actual ghost appeared, and I said, this is not for me. That's fine. But
this is an abomination, you said.
Yes, exactly. But what I think it will be useful for is as a pedagogy structure. So like the most common film writing classes that are taught in my department are adaptation classes, where you read a section, we read a novel, and and then you watch the film. So one of the ways that we as Shirley Jackson scholars can sort of keep the ball in the air is by including those visual representations in our Shirley Jackson pedagogy as a way of keeping students engaged, and also like making her work visible via the academy, which is the people in the last couple of panels have talked about the difficulty being taken seriously as a Shirley Jackson scholar or teaching a Shirley Jackson class. But these pop culture adaptation courses are already built into a lot of what the universities teach. So we can just sort of Trojan horse our way in with some Shirley Jackson Netflix and say, no, but this is the actual good stuff, is over here. Sleight of hand thing that we can do.
Yes, I did. And I think the idea that they're kind of a gateway as well to reading Jackson is really, I mean, I won't name names, but it was my brother who, having heard me talk about Shirley Jackson for 20 odd years, said to me, I finally got round to reading The Haunting of Hill House because I'd seen the TV show. And I was kind of going, if only you'd known someone who'd been recommending this work to you for many years. But he still read it, so that's, yeah, I won't shame my brother any further. But Miranda, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Okay, so I'm going to be a bit controversial and say that for the most part, probably up until about the last episode, I quite liked the adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House.
Yep.
And the reason I did is because it wasn't trying to adapt Jackson in a conventional manner. It wasn't a direct adaptation like the 1963 version, The Haunting, or the other abomination that we do not speak of from the 1990s. But it took some of the ideas that were in the novel and it played with them in interesting ways. And I think that actually kind of worked because Jackson, I would imagine, never having attempted to adapt her, but I imagine she's very difficult to adapt precisely because her writing is so layered and so complex, but also quite, I don't know, sneaky in a way. She's really good at letting the reader know what is happening while simultaneously hiding something really important from them. You know, Mary Cat's guilt in We've Always Lived in the Castle, you know, what the heck is actually going on with Elizabeth's past and her mother and Robin in Bird's Nest. The fact that Tony is a manifestation of Natalie's, you know, subconscious or her trauma in Hangs a Man. She's really good at writing these beautifully, intensely descriptive narratives while simultaneously hiding really important pieces of information. And I think Jackson's really good at manipulating the reader. And I think that kind of complex layering would be very difficult to achieve in a cinematic or televisual adaptation. Likewise, I think the manner in which Jackson so accurately and carefully represents characters' psyches and their inner world is something that's so difficult to achieve on screen. So I actually kind of like adaptations that go in a different direction and don't try to replicate Jackson's work entirely 100%, because I'm not sure if that's actually possible.
Yeah, and this is something we actually, to plug the Discord, we were talking about in it earlier in the adaptation section, where about the recent adaptation of We've Always Lived in the Castle, which is actually filmed here in Ireland. Just shout out to Ireland, and or a good stand-in for 1950s America. But it's a very sincere and incredibly, right up until the very end, an incredibly faithful adaptation and has a particular take on the Blackwood sisters. But I think in a way it almost suffers because it is so faithful to the text in a way. There's no kind of room for, in a way, kind of the weirdness that I think the novel has. Whereas, all credit to Mike Flanagan. In fairness, there's things I really did not like. The last line of that show made me want to punch a wall. But it's clearly there were a lot of really good Jackson Easter eggs. There was a respect for her work. I think there was a obvious knowledge of her work percolated in, lots of nice little references. So I think it's a really interesting point. And I'm sorry, guys, we don't have much time. I want to get to the Q&A, so I apologize if Rob or Janice were just bursting to get out an adaptation, but I do want to get to our audience and see if they have any questions. So I'm going to try and read and look at the screen at the same time, which is going to be difficult for me. So here we go. Open, there we go. Yeah, so this is a question for you, Miranda, from Megan Saunders Smith. Thank you very much, Megan. Do you read significance into the mode of murder in Castle being at odds with Mary Cat's own instincts towards weaponizing the natural? The rat poison versus mushrooms has always fascinated me. That's a great point. Yeah, why did she use rat poison, arsenic, instead of mushrooms?
That is fascinating because, like, the first thing we learn about her, or one of the first things we learn about her, is her obsession with the death cup mushroom and the fact that she knows the Latin name for it, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. But, you know, it is so interesting that she is so closely associated with the world, with the natural world, and then uses synthetic poison when dispatching her family. I mean, I do often think about the fact that it's, you know, then sort of, it becomes part of their dessert. What they're eating, I think, blackberries with sugar. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe there is that connection of like bridging those two realms, like the synthetic and the natural, the kind of the inside and the outside, the kind of the social and the natural. There's definitely something, I think, there with that. I also wonder if it kind of ties into Jackson's kind of general kind of ability to sort of mislead and manipulate and play with the reader, in that those first lines would perhaps indicate that maybe we should be looking at Mary Cat and that we should be, you know, looking at her with suspicion because she mentions the poisonous mushrooms. But then so much that happens over the course of the novel before the revelation of her guilt, so much of that then leads us to actually think, well, no, it's not her. no, this girl is not, our killer. And God, like, there's a whole lot to be said as well about Jackson's, how she draws on mystery novels and her interest in mystery novels. But I think a lot of that kind of subversion with poison as opposed, synthetic poison as opposed to a natural poison, I think maybe it ties into that misleading tendency that Jackson has in her work, where she does kind of confuse us and does lure us into the sense of security, where we do find ourselves becoming so closely aligned with Merricat as a narrator that we don't see her guilt, even though it's there in the first line. And the fact then that it's not the mushrooms that she initially mentioned, again, I think it might tie into that sort of manipulative narration that we get in the text. So I think that's one possibility anyway. But yeah, it is really interesting.
And there's a great wee moment in that drawing room scene, that splendidly, hilariously macabre drawing room scene where like the reenactment of the murder take place. And I think it's Uncle Julian says about Constance, well, she knows about herbs that could slash the lining of your stomach. And you're thinking, well, if Constance knows that much about plants, why didn't she use a plant to kill them instead of, and it's a little clue, I think, that actually, and then there's the whole Victorian murder case, the Bravo case that Ruth Franklin goes on about, and like arsenic. And don't get me started on arsenic. But,
no, I actually ended up doing a load of research on arsenic for my book, and like I ended up having to cut it. But yeah, I did end up going down that rabbit hole as well.
Everyone note this, what Miranda has just admitted for future reference, if she's involved in any high profile crimes.
Exactly.
She falls into a great inheritance.
I might, but yeah, I did end up knowing way more about arsenic than I should.
I can see the Daily Mail headline already. This is a great question, I think, to end on. And thank you so much to our people who've asked questions. We don't have time to go through them all, but I think this is a good one to end on. Any advice for a recent graduate? This is from Matilda Potter, I should say. Any advice for a recent graduate looking to pursue Jackson studies at postgrad level? And so Matilda has referred particularly to the UK, but I think, I think it'd be a good question out there to encourage. I wanted to end as well by asking how we might encourage future generations of Jackson scholars. So I'd love to hear about suggestions that people might have. I mean, maybe Rob and then Janice, if we could go to you guys, and then.
Yeah, interesting. Because I mean, the thing is, one of the things that I really like about the Jackson community in general is that it has this kind of international flavour to it. That it's kind of, you've got scholars from working all over the country. But one of the things that kind of struck me, I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of all UK institutions, is that there doesn't seem to me to be much of a kind of a concerted engagement with Jackson so much. I mean, I think she crops up here and there, but there isn't really. I mean, I wonder whether part of that is because, unlike some say, I mean, kind of, we've heard it before, kind of, like the great author kind of studies. I mean, that is just not the kind of way that we approach literature, I think, in kind of British universities. We don't tend to kind of focus on one author kind of specifically. So, your engagement with them can be quite fleeting. So in terms of, I suppose, kind of just drawing from my own kind of experiences, I mean, the thing that I just did is kind of, I just read as much as I possibly could get my hands on, which when I started the PhD in 2015 was not as much as there is now. I mean, it was really striking to me that, we had the Shirley Jackson Influences and Confluences come out in 2016. We've had the book on Shirley Jackson and Domesticity in 2020. We've had the Shirley Jackson and Companion. So I suppose, I mean, it sounds like a silly thing to say really, but I suppose it's just to kind of read. I mean, we're at a moment now where we have more scholarship on Jackson than we have ever had, and a huge variety as well. So I suppose, I mean, if you're talking about kind of at kind of PhD level, obviously one of the things that you'll kind of want to kind of focus on is the kind of the lens or kind of perspective through which you read Jackson. So I think once you've kind of got an idea of the totality of her writing, and you kind of generate that perspective that you want to approach her from, I suppose kind of working that out is the most significant kind of obstacle in some sense. But yeah, it's interesting. I'm struggling to kind of think of anything that's definitively kind of a definitively British approach to it, as opposed to kind of what I think is the strength of Jackson studies at the moment is its kind of international dimension and the way that kind of is reflected. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but just read the amount, the amount of stuff that's there to kind of read and to situate your own critical perspective in relation to is, we're very privileged at the moment to have the wealth of material that we do. And hopefully, in the next 2 years or for the duration of a PhD, there'll be a lot more that will kind of appear. So yeah, just kind of engage with the amount of material that's already there.
Janice, if you want to, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I agree with that. I think also just being aware of what's there and making sure you're not trying to replicate it, because I think that there is a lot of it out there, and a lot of the same topics end up being covered in different ways. And there is a way to approach these different topics in different ways. But you know, just reading it all. Faye has a comment in the chat that it seems as though she should apply to Bernice at Trinity College. And I would like to say that we do have.
We are outside the UK, but you know, absolutely.
Yes, we are outside the UK, but I would like to do a little sales pitch at the end. A little sales pitch at the end here that we have the wonderful Bernice Murphy, and we have, you know, I'm working at Trinity. We have a focus on popular literature, and also we do have certain courses for the undergrads on the single author and looking at the author and their work and what it means to be an author. That does end up being a focus in our university. So I'm just saying.
I think we kind of have a lot of early career people working on Jackson, but actually at the middle and of course academia is such a, let's not get started on precarity and the lack of jobs. There's it'd be great to have more Jackson people generally. That's what I'm saying in a very inchoate fashion. Sorry, I don't know if Daniel and Miranda had anything very quickly they wanted to add there, but we have to do our goodbyes, Sound of Music style. But Daniel, was there anything from the US perspective you wanted to get in there?
Yes, from the US perspective, don't let people tell you can't. That was the thing it was meant very kindly, but when it happened, but they were like, no one's going to take you seriously. And they were wrong, because 3 years later, this massive amount of actual Jackson scholars appear. So if you want to study Shirley Jackson, do it, and don't let anybody tell you no.
Follow your Jackson dreams. Thank you very much. And finally, Miranda, was there one final thing you wanted to get in there?
Yeah, just sort of going back to that earlier point about the fact that, you know, Jackson is a writer who sort of refuses generic categorization, and her work is so hybrid and it demolishes binaries and categories. That means that there's so much room for creativity and imagination in any kind of Jackson scholarship. So I think that's some incentive as well.
As Dara Danny has just put it in the chat, demand your cup of stars.
All right, that seems like...
I mean, what better way to end a panel on the future of Shirley Jackson studies than that? Guys, thank you so much. This has been brilliant. I've learned a lot. I hope it's been wonderful to chat with you all. It's been an absolute pleasure. I cannot decide who should get the crown. You all deserve the crown, and everybody out there also deserves the crown for being here tonight. So it's very unlike the ending of the Sundial, which is quite a bleak novel in some respects. Thank you so much. And now we're going to see our goodbyes, but keep the, you know, thank you so much to everybody. Okay.
Yes, so just wanted to take a few minutes here at the end and you know, say thank you all for attending. Thank you to our contributors on our website and to our speakers today. As mentioned in our WordPress, our WordPress site will still be available, as will the Discord. And we really just want to thank a whole list of people, as you can see on the slide, especially the School of English, the Trinity Long Room Hub, especially Eve, Francesca, Aoife, Lawrence Jackson Hyman, and the whole Jackson family. Data Too Short for the wonderful graphic design, Trinity Comms and Fiona for all the work in getting the word out there, and Stephen Matterson. So we also want to say happy birthday, Shirley. Thank you to Shirley Jackson as well for bringing us all together tonight and for all her wonderful work. So have a good evening and happy holidays.
Bye, everybody. Thanks very much for coming along virtually.
Thank you so much. Great. Thank you.
Safe home.
Thank you.